We'll talk now about Australian Bat Lyssavirus. What can you tell me about it?
So basically, it's a lyssavirus is the grouping. It's of the same family as the rabies virus, and it's again lives primarily in bats, but can spread over. And like most lyssaviruses, if not all lyssaviruses, it can affect any mammal. So the spread that we get from the bats is again similar to what we've just been talking about, Hendra. Although I also believe that it can infect the smaller insectivorous bats as well, and so often the mechanism for infection is not so much the urine, it's a bite from these animals. So I think it was first found in about 96, so it's pretty recent as an identification. But they've had 3 deaths, and I think they probably have all been caused by bites from bats. So the people at risk again are vets who handle bats and wildlife carers, and people that might want to rescue a bat.
And is there any way of controlling it in the wild bat population, or is it just something that's there?
Yeah, it's something that they're going to have. It's in the population. I've not seen bat lyssavirus, but I have seen and dealt with rabies, which is to all intents and purposes, I suppose, the same thing. And the issue with that is very much that it's in the populations. Bats living cheek by jowl with each other, say in caves or even under trees, are likely to squabble, shall we say, and keep spreading it amongst themselves. Again, it seems in people and most mammals, highly infectious, but it's a neurological virus in as much that it attacks the nerve system and eventually gets through to the brain and forms what they call negri bodies, which are well seen on histology. And the issue with it is that the incubation period, it depends on how far away from the brain the virus is inoculated. And I first came across it back in the UK when a dog in quarantine was released after 6 months in quarantine, quite close to where I lived in South England. And this was at Camberley, which was near military barracks, and the dog had been brought back, went through quarantine, and then shortly afterwards it went down with neurological signs and was diagnosed as rabies. And it transpired that it had contracted it from another dog that had recently arrived in the quarantine stations, because rabies is rampant in Europe. But the 6-month quarantine period of the UK was designed because of that long incubation period, so that if a dog was bitten or anybody was bitten right on the ankle, as far away from brain as it could be, well, as far away from brain as for most people, then it was going to take a long time to get there and cause the problems.
I see. That's really interesting. And so how can people protect themselves from getting this virus?
Vaccines are good. So if you're in a high-risk enterprise, so like a wildlife carer who is there. I mean, I'm a wildlife carer with my wife in Glen, and not everybody's allowed to do them. I won't let my wife touch bats because she hasn't been vaccinated. The one lady that does do it, she's been vaccinated, although earlier in her career she wasn't vaccinated and got bitten. Mercifully, she didn't develop any problems with it. But it's really important to do that. But you mustn't just rely on vaccines. You've got to use the proper protective clothing, so like thick leather gloves and gauntlets, really. It only takes a small scratch to let the virus in if it's dribbled with saliva, because the old name of rabies, and I'm not certain, I don't think it's quite such a prominent feature of that lyssavirus, but rabies was hydrophobia, which is fear of water, and they used to dribble masses of saliva out. So you'd see pictures from 17, 1800s of these animals drooling saliva out, little black and white line drawings, you know? And so that saliva is riddled with the virus. So the bite is there, the saliva gets in, and the virus is in. So you've got to prevent being bitten. But the other one is that you immediately use soap and water to kill off the virus. Soap seems to be the best thing, rather than hunt around for anything more modern. Go for that virus. Go for that soap and water and give a good old wash to really try and get it. So bleeding, it will help flush the things out. But obviously bite marks are awfully puncture wounds. So that would be a major problem. But interestingly, if you go back and look at rabies in South America, that's spread by the vampire bat, right? So that's Desdemonas or something. Desmodus, I think its Latin name is. And what that does is it lives in caves, and it spreads through the colonies in these big caves. And there were some potholers, spelunkers, or whatever they call themselves, that went in, and one of them contracted the rabies by breathing in the droplets that were in this cave. And apparently it was really interesting. I've never read it, but there was I remember them telling us at college, there was a diary this chap wrote about, you know, what was happening to him, and in it he includes the description of this advancing rabies. So that's a really interesting, because the bat there, the vampire bat down there, it gets its food, which is blood, by flying through and at night picking up horses and cattle, dropping onto the ground and flopping along, as you can imagine a sort of a bat might, and then latching onto the bottom of their legs and sucking the blood out of the bottom of the legs, right? And the blood is dribbling down because they've got that sort of anticoagulant in there. So that's how they spread, and that's partly influential in the length of the incubation period of how they know that those animals will take longer to become infected with the disease, or to become affected by the disease. So that's one way. Of course, the other one, which we don't have in Australia with the bat lyssavirus, is that we basically don't have it in the other feral animals. But you go to Europe, and you've got masses of dogs there and foxes and so forth that's spreading because of the changes in the brain that are brought about by the virus. And so wild animals, feral animals, are a big problem, all mammals. And so you've got to look at the risk in all the different places that you're going to, so that an urban, dare I say, Sydneyite, if goes to a foreign part, finds a poor, lonely, lost little puppy and picks it up to cuddle it, worst thing you do, because that's animals already potentially going through the changes in the brain, altering its behavior, and next thing you know, you've got an animal that bites you, scratches you, and you've got rabies. But you don't even think about rabies, because we don't have rabies in Australia.
Right. So in Australia, it's only in bats. Is that correct?
It does seem to be bats that are there. We don't have it in the native wildlife, as we know. There's no cases that I'm aware of in any of our native populations.
Okay, that's fascinating, and the relationships with other diseases in other countries. Is there
Yeah.
anything else about Australian bat lyssavirus you'd like to share?
Look, it's really interesting. I don't again know over much, but the other lists of viruses, including rabies, they cause two forms of behavioral change. One is madness, so the violent, aggressive type thing, like the typical picture of a rabid dog in a horror movie. And the other form, which we tend to see more in cattle and horses, which is what we call a dumb form. So you get mad rabies and dumb rabies. And so this whole behavior change is an indication of what's happening in the brain. And I'm not certain, I don't know what the effects are in bats as to whether it's a dumb or an aggressive form, or whether there are both forms. I tend to get the impression that it's a dumb form in the bats rather than aggressive form. So again, stirring up that emotion of wanting to help rather than a mad form, which would say, oh, keep away from that, there's something wrong with it.
I see. That's interesting, particularly in rescue, I guess.
Yeah,
It could be mistaken for an injured or a sick bat, and
yeah,
whereas in fact it has this particular illness, which is quite dangerous.
yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you
I mean,
once.
I said one of the classic ones that I had involved was in North Yemen. No, sorry, Saudi Arabia. I had one where another vet who was working for, let's just say, a senior member of the royal family, it said, look, rang me up and said, Nigel, I've got these cattle and one of them's bellowing. And it just won't stop bellowing. And I said, oh, I've got to think of rabies, because that's one of the potential signs. So anyway, he went away and he rang me back and he said, oh, another one's bellowing. And I he said, it's incoordinated. So I said, well, I went back through history and we were looking at things that had happened were there other possibilities? Because you've always got to think of the other things as well. Anyway, they just changed the watering system. Have they stirred up something with that? Anyway, 2 days later, he arrived and he'd taken out the brain in a post-mortem of one of these animals that had died, and it was just lying there on the top of some ice. And I knew he didn't have any proper facilities for taking it at our place. We did have, and it came back positive. And he said, oh, I'm vaccinated, I'll be all right. And that one did turn out positive. And it then transpired, when we mapped out the animals that were affected, they were in a straight line. And then they found that somebody had seen a fox behaving strangely running through the cattle yards. So we can only assume that it had gone through, bitten everything in sight, and these animals had gone down. So then in earlier than that, back in 1980 in North Yemen, I got called to a dairy farm again by the leader of the country, and they got cattle that were bellowing. And I went up into the mountains where they were, and I diagnosed rabies, basically, on the strength of what I was seeing. And there the problem was that they had a lot of wild dogs around. And we had a real problem there, because we couldn't shoot the dogs, because it was pretty much on the edge of a war zone between North Yemen and South Yemen. And the tribes were fighting each other, and they wouldn't allow firearms to be used because it would just raise the ante. So that was a real problem of how to control it in that population. In Saudi, they died out because there were large areas of desert where nothing could survive.
Mm-hmm.
In North Yemen, where up in the mountains, there was no desert. There was lots of fodder for them to eat, and animals and sheep and guts and entrails of slaughtered animals. So they actually thrived. So it kept on going and going and going. Very interesting.
Certainly, yeah, the distribution and the climate and the political scene all playing a part in the
Yeah,
spread and persistence of that
absolutely.
disease.
And but we had to try and do something because of the it was the leader of the country. He wanted this problem sorted. So we did overcome it in the end. We found a suitable poison to put out, and we baited. We brought it out. I suppose the other thing that was interesting is that because I'd examined these animals, they put them in an old stone building. I suppose the interesting thing was that I was worried, knowing about those spelunkers in South America, that I was actually going to breathe in the droplets with the virus while I was examining it. So, and I hadn't had rabies vaccine at that stage, so I had to put myself through a not very comfortable course of vaccine, but I didn't go down with it, so it must have worked.
It was worth it, definitely. Terrific. Well, thank you again, Nigel. As always, fascinating, great stories, and great information about Lyssavirus in Australia in the bat population, but also in other parts of the world across many different species.
Yeah. Look, I think if I could, the one thing I think I'd like to emphasise is that these bats don't just stay in Australia. You look at the distribution maps of the bats that cover Australia, the fruit bats, they go way up into Asia, and one of them goes way up to Nepal. Right, so that's northern India, north of India, and that's a long, long way. There's an awful lot of viruses in between Australia and Nepal that these migrating bats could bring us. Oh, very interesting, very interesting.
Certainly, and the emergence of new diseases is something that we can't rule out because of just that natural behaviour.
Absolutely, absolutely. The more we find out about it, the more interesting it is. And what was really interesting also are some of those insect-borne diseases, but that's a topic for another day, perhaps.